Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather, and today is a doozy. It's about a serial killer named Clifford Olson Jr., who was convicted of murdering over 11 youth, but that number is probably much, much higher. This is your warning. I have added some information that people could find very disturbing or triggering, as there's very young people involved in this case. This case was by far the hardest for me to research, and I've always known about it. It's in my area, it happened here, but learning the details was very upsetting, mostly because of all the kids that were involved. It's honestly shocking to me that Clifford Olson is not one of the top 5 serial killers in the world. He is so vile. This episode is also really long, so it's going to be a 2-part episode. So stay with me, subscribe if you don't want to miss episode 2 next week. Let's get into it. Clifford Olson is known as the Beast of British Columbia for the killing of 11 children and young adults in the 1980s. He's also known as the rent-a-car killer because he was known to always rent new cars for each killing he did. Clifford Olson was born on January 1st, 1940 in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and he was one of 5 babies who were featured in the local newspaper from being born on New Year's Day. He was the oldest of 4 children, and he grew up in Richmond, BC, which is just outside of Vancouver, BC. Clifford's father was in the military when the kids were little, which meant that he rarely saw Clifford as a baby or even as a young toddler. He did eventually come home from overseas, and they moved into a subdivision for Army servicemen that was created by the government. There was similar housing where I grew up, and we referred to it as the base or the PMQs. So friends that lived there, we would say, oh, they live on the base, or they're from the PMQs. Anyway, when Clifford was still a child, it said that his dad basically ignored all the kids, and according to Clifford, they never really had a real father-son relationship. He denies ever being abused, but as long as Clifford and his siblings were out of the way, his dad basically let them do whatever they wanted. After Clifford's dad was discharged from the military, he worked as a milkman for a while before going into construction and also worked as a building manager. When I first started looking into this case, it said that his dad wasn't a bad guy or anything. He held steady work, his siblings grew up fine. However, I did find an old newspaper article from 1961 that said Clifford's dad, who was also known as Clifford Olson, was arrested for using fake bingo cards. So maybe Clifford did learn from his dad that people can get what they want just by cheating. Because Clifford and his dad didn't really have much of a relationship, it's said that he turned to his mom and was a bit of a mama's boy. His mother at one point was working for a fish cannery and also a housekeeper, but I would suspect that she was the main caregiver of the family. Clifford was said to be a bit needy with his mom, and she was known for just giving in to whatever he wanted and never really punished him for when he was bad. Apparently, he also wasn't an easy child to raise, so giving in to him was just easier than dealing with his tantrums or his outbursts. As Clifford grew up, he was in trouble a lot. Mostly when he was young, it was for things like being a bully or being a petty thief. He would just take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, as early as the age of 5. And he often picked on kids smaller than him and lied about everything. It got to the point that nobody really knew if he was telling the truth or just making up stories. His teachers would say that he even did that when there was no reason to lie. It's also said that he was a bit of a show-off, and he just required a lot of attention. Clifford would eventually drop out of school by grade 8, and he went to work for the racetrack. There would be a huge long list of things that Clifford Olson would be known for, whether it be shooting a rifle at planes outside the airport, pickpocketing, breaking into buildings or homes. He was always getting in trouble as a juvenile, and nothing could stop him. He just did not care. At the age of 17, he was finally arrested and sent to jail for break and enter. He wasn't in jail for very long before he would break out of prison, but it only lasted a few days before he turned himself in. After that, Clifford Olson was in and out of jail numerous times. he would rack up around 90 different convictions. This would be from things like possession of stolen property, forgery, possession of firearms, false pretenses, parole violation, armed robbery, obstruction of justice, break and enter, theft, fraud, escape from lawful custody. He escaped prison over 7 times. And for some reason, whenever he escaped, he would just often return on his own. He didn't really have anywhere to go, and sometimes he'd go home for a shower, or he'd hide in the woods just waiting to be caught. It was just more of a game to him. One of his more famous escapes was from BC Penitentiary, where he was serving 3.5 years for break and enter. He pretended he was sick, and he fled from 3 guards that were bringing him in for medical attention. There would be a chase of over a dozen police, and he would spend the night under the Queensboro Bridge. He would be on the front page of the news while police continued their search, and his parents even begged him to turn himself in. A full week passed before he was caught across the border in Blaine, Washington, by a police dog. Now, according to prison guards, he didn't have the capability of comprehending the consequences for his actions. Everything in life was something he could manipulate or control. He just did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and rules just never applied to him. Prison wasn't a punishment, it was just part of his life. While in prison, he also had his first homosexual experience. He has claimed to prefer women, but in reality, he just would have sex with anyone. In 1974, when he was only 34 years old, he was accused of sexual attacks on a 17-year-old fellow inmate numerous times. And as far as I know, he wasn't charged with anything, though. When Clifford wasn't in jail, by his own admissions, he says that he was often having sex with very young boys or girls, and this was well before he was caught. For some reason, he was just never seen or labeled as a sexual predator. He was more known for being a manipulator or a con artist. And maybe that's why he preyed upon youth, because they're more naive and can be easily taken advantage of. One of his many victims before the conviction of murdering 11 kids was named Debbie, a 23-year-old who looked much younger than her age. Olson had just been released from prison and was on parole when he picked up Debbie. And this particular account was in a book I read called The Predator, The Life and Crimes of Serial Killer Clifford Olson. I will link it below. So Debbie was hitchhiking outside of the Okanagan, which is in the interior of British Columbia, and she was picked up by Olson and another man named John. And she told Olson that she was traveling to Manning Park, BC. So Manning Park is mostly known for being a ski resort, but in the off-season, it's full of camping and hiking. It's a really popular place. So Olson told her that he knew Manning Park well, so told her to get into the car and he would take her there and offer her a beer. Olson had allegedly met John, the other man in the car, earlier that day when Olson wanted to head off to Vancouver. He had offered John $20 and a case of beer to join him. It was Olson's idea to pick up Debbie when they noticed her on the side of the road. Knowing what we know now of Olson, John was lucky because he was probably going to be a victim of Olson until he saw Debbie. After they picked up Debbie, Olson would take Debbie for lunch in Karamias, a town not far from where they picked her up. And just like other serial killers, he was always charming and generous with his victims, very manipulative. So when they got out to Karamias, he would also check himself into a hotel room there and told Debbie that he was just too tired to continue, but they'd go to Manning Park the next day. And John didn't stick around. Instead, he would take his $20 and go home, leaving the case of beer with Olson and Debbie. And over the next 6 weeks, Olson would keep Debbie. He would never let her out of his sight. At one point, he even brought her to his parents' house and introduced her as a girlfriend. But most times, she was just a sex slave and he drugged her and held her captive. He would force her to take baths in front of him, and he instructed her what to do and how to wash herself. And other times, he would be the one to wash her. Sometimes he'd make her rub baby oil on her skin, and he would make her shave herself in front of him and just abuse her in horrible, horrible ways that I won't go into further, but it just sounds very twisted and creepy. Debbie did finally escape, and she ended up going to Nova Scotia, which is the other side of the country. And she would mostly live with her uncle there, but she would also be in and out of psychiatric hospitals for years. And she just never was the same after. That experience was really damaging to her. And this would be Clifford Olson's MO. Preying on hitchhikers, young adults, or people that he could overpower easily. He was only 5'7" and 155 pounds, so he was not a big man. I'm bigger than he is. So all his victims were just people that were much smaller than he was. He'd give them alcohol or drugs laced with pills just to knock them out so he could do whatever he wanted and take full advantage of them. Debbie was lucky she got away because there would be many more victims that wouldn't. Now, remember, Olson had just been released from prison when he picked up Debbie, and he was on parole. So shortly after Debbie escaped, his parole was revoked. And that was due to him skipping out on hotel bills, theft, and other scams. So he would just return to jail again. Over the next 10 years or so, he would be in and out of jail several more times. He was always scamming people, manipulating everyone in sight. He was just an awful person. He didn't have friends. He only had victims. And the amount of times that he was arrested and jailed is just so mind-blowing in itself. We do not have this 3-strike rule in Canada. By the age of 40, Olson was released from jail again. And within about a month of being released, he would meet Joan Hale. And not long after that, they would get married. He met his wife, Joan Hale, in a bar. Joan was said to be an anxious woman, shy, and just not very confident. She was recently divorced and went to the bar with a girlfriend for a night out. Very reminiscent of Ted Bundy and Elizabeth. Joan would later say that she was deeply in love with Olson, but also terrified him at the same time because he would just get angry so easily. He was very unpredictable. The biggest red flag that she ignored was that she doesn't even remember leaving the bar with her friends on the first night they met. She thought she had gotten into a cab with her girlfriends, but she would wake up the next morning in a hotel room next to Clifford. But despite that, she fell deeply in love with him. While they were dating, Olson's own mother would tell Joan not to do anything to upset Olson because there was no telling what he might do. He would also admit to her that he was actually on parole, but all those warnings didn't stop her and she stuck around. Olson could be very charming and very likable when he was in a good mood. Joan did have some suspicions that Olson was up to something, but she didn't really know what, so she would just turn a blind eye and just do her best not to upset him or rock the boat. Even when they did fight or he'd badly beat her, she always took him back. And she said that there was just something really magnetic about him. Joan would become pregnant by July after only 5 months of dating. And they'd have a son in April of 1981 and then got married 1 month later on May 15th, 1981. Little did Joan know that Clifford had started a major murder spree while they were building their life together and starting their new family. 6 months before they got married, Clifford had abducted a girl named Christine Weller on November 17, 1980 in Surrey, British Columbia, which is about 15 miles from Vancouver. Christine was only 12 years old at the time and living with her parents, Rick and Rolly, in a hotel on King George Highway. They were considered low income because her parents were struggling to find employment. It was the 80s and lots of families in the 80s were struggling. But this hotel was on the highway, tucked in between businesses like car lots and fast food chains, just not a place that Christine liked at all. After school that day, she did a bit of window shopping with her friend Clive, and Christine needed to be home by 5 o'clock for dinner. So she borrowed her friend's bike to go back to her hotel for dinner, promising Clive to return the bike the next day. And her friend was a bit leery to lend out his bike, but she promised to bring it back, so he agreed. Later that evening, she would ride Clive's bike beside her dad as he walked to a nearby pub for a beer. Her dad kissed her cheek goodbye and told her to go straight home, but Christine didn't. Instead, she sort of stuck around the parking lot, riding the bike and just hanging out. And Olson was in a particularly bad mood that night because Joan had apparently left him. Clifford had beat Joan the night before, and she just got fed up. So she wrote a note and walked on foot to her mom's house while she was pregnant. She would later reveal that she was contemplating suicide, but she didn't want to end the life of her unborn baby. And Clifford was apparently driving around trying to find her. And this is when Olson saw Christine. Olson would pull up beside her and ask Christine what a young girl like her was doing alone. It wasn't safe for her to be alone at night. And she would tell him that her dad was having a beer and that she was just going to be going home. Olson could probably sense that she didn't have a lot of money, so he offered her a job washing windows. By today's standards, that does seem strange. I would like to think 12-year-old girls would not be getting job offers by strange men, but this was the 80s. And Christine's family didn't have a lot of money, so this actually intrigued her. And Olson would tell her that he wanted to show her where to meet the following morning for work. Now, it's said by Olson that she was excited to get a job and earn money. So she agreed and she got into the car, but she made him promise to bring her back to the hotel right away because her dad would be mad if she wasn't home. So she would lean the bike up against the wall and hop in. According to Olson, he would give her a beer that was drugged with pills. And once she was passed out, Olson would sexually abuse her many times before dumping her clothes in the Fraser River and disposing of her body. The next morning, it said that Olson phoned Joan's parents' house where he thought Joan may be, and they made up. Joan was taking Clifford back. They decided to take a trip down to Bellingham, Washington as a honeymoon. Joan thought Olson was such a romantic guy, and she just couldn't even remember why she had left him the night before. About a week later, Clive's dad was mad because his bike still hadn't been returned. So Clive's dad would go to the hotel and speak with Christine's parents. She wasn't in school and nobody had seen her. Sadly, her parents would admit that they hadn't seen her either, and they thought that she was with Clive. Clive's dad suggested that they call the police. Since Christine hadn't been reported missing for that entire time, the police assumed that she was just a runaway, so they didn't really try and find her or take the missing persons report that seriously. Christine Weller was sadly found on Christmas Day, 1980, by a man walking his dog along the Fraser River dikes. Police discovered that she was strangled and had over 10 stab wounds all over her body. Even though by this time her body would be badly decomposed, there was also undeniable evidence that she was also beat and raped repeatedly. Olson would later blame Joan for the murder of Christine because she was the one that made him mad and it was all her fault. Over the next 5 months, Olson would continue to pick up kids, bribe them with jobs, drug them, and rape them. And many he considered killing, but most he actually let go. These kids never reported the rape, sadly, and most of them were low-income street kids. They already had a tough life, and I'm sure they just let it go from either embarrassment or thinking no one would believe them, or whatever manipulative threats that Olson gave them. In the beginning of April, Olson and his pregnant wife, Joan, would move into public housing in Coquitlam, BC. Public housing is classified as low-income housing, and their son would be born April 10th, 1981. On April 16th, 1981, just 6 days after Clifford and Joan's son was born, he met Colleen Dignault, a shy 13-year-old girl who was going home from a friend's house in Surrey. He used the same window washing job offer on Colleen as he did with Christine. She was also offered beer and $50 if she'd accompany him to Squamish to get supplies for her new job. Instead, he took her to South Surrey, where he would go on to drugging and raping her too. Afterwards, he would show up at the hospital to see Joan and the baby with blood still on his shirt. It said that Joan was furious because he was dirty and had blood on his shirt, but she thought it was best not to know. So again, she ignored her intuition just to avoid confrontation. Sadly, police treated Colleen as a runaway too, even though her aunt tried to tell police that she felt Colleen was in some sort of trouble. Colleen would have needed to take 2 different bus routes to get home from her friend's house that afternoon, and she wasn't seen on either of them. Her aunt would go on to say that Colleen was a normal 13-year-old girl. There was no problems in school, she would never tried to run away before, and it would be very upsetting to her that Colleen was classified as a runaway. Just 3 days later, she would be found in a wooded area around 144th and 26th Avenue in Surrey with evidence of rape and her head smashed in by a construction hammer. On April 22, 1981, just 1 week later, Olson abducted Darren Todd Johnson-Rood, who was 16 years old and on his way to the store for some cigarettes when Olson picked him up. Darren was visiting relatives in Coquitlam, BC for Easter and originally from Saskatchewan. Olson offered Darren alcohol and marijuana as well as a job. Olson told him that he would take him to the job site where he was to meet his coworkers who also drank and smoked weed. And just like the others, Darren was drugged, raped, and beaten with a hammer. He'd then be left by the Fraser River in Mission, BC, only 45 minutes away. Joan and Clifford Olson would then get married on May 17, 1981, at the People's Full Gospel Church. Stephen, their son, would also be baptized in that same church. The Olsons, specifically Clifford, gave the impression that they were devout Christians, especially to their fellow churchgoers. Clifford even had ads on the church bulletin asking people for help with odd jobs like window washing. 2 days after the wedding, on May 19th, Clifford saw Sandra Wolfsteiner, a tall, pretty 16-year-old who was hitchhiking to Langley from Surrey to go see a friend. And using the same pickup lines, washing windows for $10 an hour, he piqued Sandra's curiosity. She wasn't as quick to accept the job offer, so Olson would also offer her an apartment at a discount if she worked for him. Her mom was struggling to pay the bills, so Sandra accepted the offer. A new job, more money, and a new place to live. This would totally help out her mom, and just like the others, she hopped in the car, and Olson offered her too a beer and $80 if she'd go with him to pick up tools in Chilliwack. He would drive up to Cultus Lake, which is in Chilliwack, BC, and then he'd go off onto a logging road to a cabin where the tools were said to be at. And this cabin would be imaginary. So Sandra got suspicious and had allegedly asked Clifford if he was going to kill her. Olson would pull over and he would lead her by foot into the woods, telling her that this cabin wasn't far from the road. When they got far enough off the logging road, he beat her with a hammer and raped her as well. Olson would say she was still breathing when he left her. After driving away, he would throw her belongings out the window and the hammer into a creek. Witnesses would say that they saw Sandra getting into a gray 2-door vehicle. Unfortunately, that tip didn't turn out any leads because Olson just kept renting vehicles. He would clean them out, return them, and then rent a new one a couple weeks later. On June 21st, 1981, 13-year-old Ada Court was trying to catch a bus in front of her brother's apartment, where she had just finished babysitting her nieces. Clifford pulled over and asked her where she was going. She told him Burnaby, and Olson quickly said that he was also heading that way and he could give her a ride. She also got the beer spiked with pills and passed out while Olson drove on. She would also be taken to an old logging road where she too was beat with a hammer and raped. Sadly, Olson's victims didn't trigger a massive search. Nobody knew or realized that a serial killer was on the loose. Most of these kids were considered runaways by the police, and further investigations never happened. Olson also left their bodies in different towns within the Lower Mainland, which resulted in different RCMP detachments dealing with these kids. This prevented law enforcement to connect the crimes together because they didn't share resources. Ada Court would be the first victim that piqued the RCMP's interest, though, because she didn't really fit the profile of a runaway kid. Olson would ramp up his killing spree and would take 6 more victims in the month of July. On July 2nd, Olson was working a real job doing a bathroom tile renovation. He would take a lunch break to grab burgers for him and a coworker when he saw 9-year-old Simon Partington, who was riding his bike to a friend's house. Simon was a kid who loved science, who loved planets, and attended Catholic school. Olson had offered Simon some money if Simon could help pick up some firewood at a nearby apartment. Now, Simon was only 9, so he actually told Olson that he would need to ask his parents' permission first. And Olson agreed that was a smart idea, and he would take him home so he could ask. They first stopped for candy at a gas station, and Olson offered the 9-year-old a beer and promised not to tell his parents. It would be their secret. Now, Simon was worried that his parents would find out about the beer, so Olson would tell Simon that he had a special pill to stop the effects of alcohol. Simon would take the pill and pass out. Olson took him to a clearing across from the same spot he killed Christine Weller. He would use his belt to strangle Simon, rape him, and repeatedly stab him. He dragged Simon into the bushes to hide his body. Olson would then grab the burgers and he went back to work by 1 p.m. and his coworker never suspected a thing. Simon's death is one that hits me hard. Not that the other killings weren't horrific, but Simon was so young. He was only 9 years old. Then learning that Olson went and got lunch after brutally murdering Simon makes my blood boil and just makes me feel sick. He didn't care at all about his victims. And this is where we're going to stop. There is a lot more to tell, more victims, more investigation, the conviction, and how he was in prison. So don't forget to come back next week. Hit subscribe if you don't want to miss out. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.